She stood beside a man the world feared, yet it was her quiet hand that shaped the destiny of a nation. Behind the cold eyes of Francisco Franco, there was always Carmen Polo, a woman whose pearls hid the weight of Spain's future. On a sweltering summer night in July 1936, Madrid's streets were not quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a ragged burst of gunfire cracked through the humid air, the sound bouncing off stone facades like the memory of old wars. Carmen sat by a dim oil lamp in a borrowed apartment, her fingers moving silently over a rosary. The scent of wax and dust filled the room. She was alone, except for the sound of her own breath and the knowledge that her husband, stationed far away in the Canary Islands, was on the brink of a decision that would either save or destroy them both. The lamp's light caught the glint of her necklace, a string of flawless pearls cool against her skin, a gift from her father years ago, meant to remind her of refinement, tradition, and the weight of family honor. But tonight, they felt like stones. Outside, Spain was tearing itself apart. The old order that had nurtured her childhood, the church's authority, the respect for aristocracy, the safety of familiar customs, was being dismantled piece by piece. She thought of the anti-clerical riots in the streets, the burned churches, the jeering faces of men who saw religion as an enemy. In moments like this, the choice seemed clear. If the world she had known was to survive, men like her husband would have to seize it back, and women like her would have to steel themselves for what that would mean. But this was not the first time Carmen had faced the threat of loss. Born on June 11, 1900 in Oviedo, Asturias, she had been raised in a world of certainty. Her father, a wealthy and devout man, surrounded her with the rituals of the Catholic faith and the etiquette of high society. Sundays were for Mass in the Grand Church, afternoons for promenades along shaded boulevards, evenings for conversation under the glow of gaslight. She was educated not only in the reading of Scripture, but in the unspoken language of social standing, the graceful turn of a head, the precision of formal address, the way to make one's presence felt without raising one's voice. Asturias was a land of contrasts, green hills rolling into coal-mine valleys, fishing villages clustered under the cliffs of the Cantabrian Sea. The air smelled of salt and rain, and the people carried in them both the pride of tradition and the stubbornness of survival. Carmen loved her home, but she was taught early that her life's purpose would extend beyond it. She would marry well, maintain the dignity of her family, and above all, uphold the faith. She met Francisco Franco Bahamonde in the early 1920s, during one of those carefully orchestrated social encounters where families of standing crossed paths with rising military officers. He was not from a wealthy house, but there was something in his bearing, the crisp lines of his uniform, the way he spoke little but meant every word, that made her pause. Franco at that time was a young officer marked for advancement, having already served in Morocco and distinguished himself in combat. His eyes were dark and unblinking, the eyes of a man who measured the world in terms of discipline and duty. Their courtship was not the swift, impulsive romance of novels. It unfolded slowly, under the watchful gaze of families who weighed status as carefully as character. Carmen's parents, proud of their aristocratic lineage, were hesitant. Franco's family, though respectable, lacked wealth, and his career, while promising, was bound to the uncertainties of the army. Yet Carmen saw something her parents did not, a resolve as immovable as the granite cliffs of Asturias. She sensed that he would not simply serve in history, he would carve a place in it. In 1923, they married. The wedding was a union not only of two people, but of two visions, his of a disciplined, ordered Spain, and hers of a Spain rooted in faith and tradition. It was a modest ceremony by aristocratic standards, yet Carmen carried herself as though she were stepping into a palace. She knew she would not simply be the wife of an officer, she would be the silent custodian of his ambitions. The early years of their marriage were marked by separations. Franco was sent to Morocco, where Spain fought a brutal colonial war against the Rif tribes. Carmen remained in Spain, managing the domestic front with the poise expected of her. Letters came rarely, often brief and formal, but she read between the lines, sensing his growing stature among the officer corps. With every promotion, every commendation, she refined her own role, appearing at military functions, forging connections with officers' wives, and earning the quiet respect of men who noticed that Franco's home life was as orderly as his campaigns. The Morocco years were a crucible for both of them. Franco learned the art of survival in battle. Carmen learned the art of survival in society. She began to see the contours of a life where public image could be as decisive as military strategy. She also began to shape Franco's thinking, reinforcing the belief that chaos and secularism were enemies to be fought with the same determination as any armed foe. By the late 1920s, Franco's rise seemed unstoppable. He was the youngest general in Europe, a man whose reputation for discipline was matched only by his caution in politics. Carmen understood that restraint was part of his strength. He did not bluster like other officers, he calculated, and while he calculated, she cultivated. Her social standing opened doors that would otherwise have been closed to a man of his background. In return, his growing prominence gave her a platform to embody the virtues of a Spain she feared was slipping away. Yet beneath the appearances, Carmen sensed the first tremors of change. The monarchy that had framed their early married life was weakening. The streets of Madrid were restless with voices calling for reform, for secularism, for the dismantling of the old order. Carmen, deeply anchored in Catholic tradition, saw in these demands not liberation, but disintegration. And in the shadows of this political storm, she began to realize that Franco's destiny and hers would not be shaped by the steady climb of peacetime promotion, but by the violent upheaval that was coming. The summer night in Madrid returned to her mind, the echo of gunfire, the smell of candle wax, the weight of the pearls. Spain was about to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. And when it did, she knew she would stand beside Franco not only as a wife, but as a pillar of the cause he would choose. Whether the world called it salvation or tyranny, it would be their shared fate. The Morocco sun was unlike any Carmen had ever known. It was a harsh, merciless light that seemed to strip the world of softness, bleaching the hills into bone white and turning the horizon into a wavering mirage. She saw it first not with her own eyes, but through the letters Franco sent her. Sparse pages, their words pressed into paper with the firmness of a man who did not waste ink. There were no romantic flourishes, no sighs of longing, only clipped accounts of battles, movements, and men lost. Yet between the lines, Carmen read the exhaustion and the quiet pride of a soldier who was being tempered into steel. When Franco departed for the Rif War, Carmen had imagined it as a campaign of distant skirmishes and orderly marches. She had been wrong. The Rifian tribes fought with a ferocity born of defending their own land, striking from the mountains, vanishing into the desert. The Spanish soldiers, many poorly equipped and far from home, bled under the African sun. In those years, Franco learned not only to fight, but to endure. He came to understand that victory was not only in the clash of weapons, but in the discipline to outlast the enemy. For Carmen, Morocco was an education of a different kind. She was not there in the dust and gunpowder, but she lived the war in Madrid's military quarters, in the hushed conversations of officers' wives, in the telegrams that arrived without warning. She learned to hold her composure when others broke down in grief, to manage her household with an efficiency that reflected well on her absent husband, to be seen as both gracious and unshakable. In the world they inhabited, an officer's wife was an extension of his reputation. Carmen understood this instinctively. Her presence at receptions, her conversations in drawing rooms, her ability to show sympathy without appearing sentimental, all of it was noticed. Men who served with Franco saw that his life off the battlefield was as disciplined as his conduct on it. This, too, was a kind of warfare. One fought in salons and corridors rather than on ridgelines and river crossings. And Carmen fought it well. The war was brutal. In 1924, the disaster at Annual had left thousands of Spanish soldiers dead. And though Franco was not to blame, the shadow of that defeat hung over every officer. Yet in the chaos, Franco distinguished himself. He was known for leading from the front, for refusing to send his men where he would not go himself. His courage in the assault on Mount Jebel el Musa became the stuff of military rumor, earning him rapid promotion. Carmen, reading of these honors in the press, felt both pride and a growing awareness that her husband was no longer just a career officer. He was becoming a figure other men would follow without question. By 1926, Franco was the youngest general in Europe. The appointment was a triumph, but it was also a pivot. The boy from Galicia, the outsider to the aristocracy, now stood among Spain's highest military ranks. Carmen understood the significance. It was not simply that he had risen, it was that he had done so through a discipline so absolute it bordered on asceticism. And that discipline was something she matched in her own sphere. The life of a general's wife required an artful balance. To be visible but not ostentatious. To project dignity without arrogance. To embody tradition without appearing inflexible. Carmen excelled in it. Her appearance was always immaculate, her manners flawless. She became known for the pearls she wore at nearly every public occasion. A visual reminder of her refinement, but also for her, a talisman of the order she sought to preserve in a changing world. Yet even as Franco's career soared, Spain itself was shifting. The old monarchy under King Alfonso XIII was wobbling under the weight of political unrest and military failures. Republican ideals were spreading, and with them came demands for secularization, workers' rights, and regional autonomy. In Asturias, Carmen's birthplace, labor movements were gaining ground, strikes becoming more frequent. She viewed these developments with unease. The values she had been raised with, deference to the church, respect for hierarchy, the stability of tradition, seemed under siege. Franco, though cautious in public statements, was equally unsettled. Morocco had taught him the dangers of underestimating an enemy and the necessity of a firm, unyielding command. To him, the political left in Spain was no less dangerous than the Riffian fighters in the hills, disorganized perhaps, but capable of sudden, destructive force. Carmen, in her private conversations with him during rare reunions, reinforced this perception. To her, the rise of secularism and socialism was not merely a political shift, but a moral collapse. By the end of the 1920s, they had settled into a rhythm. He as the soldier commander, she as the steward of their public image and household order. Their marriage was not built on daily intimacy, but on mutual purpose. Each understood the other's role in the architecture of ambition they were constructing. Still, Carmen knew that ambition alone could not protect them from the storms gathering over Spain. She had seen enough in the quiet panic of Madrid's salons and the whispered news from Asturias to sense that the next upheaval would not be fought in the deserts of Africa, but in the streets of Spain itself. And when that day came, she would once again have to play her part, not with a rifle or a regiment, but with the quiet weapons of influence, loyalty, and unshakable resolve. What neither she nor Franco could know was how soon that day would arrive, and how completely it would pull them both into the heart of a conflict that would remake Spain and their lives forever. The streets of Spain had changed. The air no longer carried the steady hum of tradition, but the restless, uneven pulse of a nation rethinking itself. Carmen first felt it in the silences between church bells, those familiar chimes now drowned out by the chanting of crowds. What began as distant murmurs in political circles became an unstoppable wave. In April 1931, the monarchy collapsed under the weight of public discontent, and the Second Spanish Republic was declared. For Carmen, it was as if the foundation of her life had shifted under her feet. The Republic promised reform. To its supporters, it was a breath of freedom after centuries of monarchy and clerical power. But to Carmen, deeply rooted in her Catholic upbringing and aristocratic sensibilities, it was a slow unraveling. Churches were desecrated in anti-clerical violence. Religious schools were closed or stripped of influence. The clergy, once honored and protected, now faced public hostility. Carmen walked the streets of Madrid with a new wariness, feeling the gaze of a different Spain on her back. Franco, by then a national figure in the military, watched the political transformation with measured caution. Publicly, he kept his views restrained, as was his habit. Privately, his disdain for the Republic's direction was clear. Discipline and unity were his virtues. The Republic, in his eyes, was fragmenting the country into factions. Socialists, anarchists, communists, separatists, each pulling against the other. Carmen became his most constant confidant in these years, the person with whom he could speak without restraint. Over evening meals behind closed doors, they talked about what Spain was becoming. She had a way of framing the turmoil not merely as political instability, but as a moral decline. The burning of convents was not just vandalism, it was an attack on the soul of Spain. The strikes and protests were not simply economic grievances, they were signs of a society tearing itself away from the order and faith that had sustained it. In 1932, when a faction of the army attempted an ill-fated coup against the Republic, Franco was not among them, a deliberate choice that preserved his position and avoided suspicion. It was the kind of decision Carmen understood well. He did not act impulsively. He waited, studied, and struck only when the ground was firm. Yet even as he avoided political traps, Franco's steady rise was watched with both admiration and suspicion. Within the army, he was seen as incorruptibly disciplined. Within the Republic, he was seen as a potential threat. Carmen sensed that the danger was growing. When Franco was appointed to command the military academy at Zaragoza, she embraced the move as a refuge from Madrid's political fever. In Zaragoza, they lived in relative calm. Carmen kept her household impeccable, entertained visiting officers and their wives, and maintained the appearance of stability. Yet even here, the Republic's reach was felt. In 1931, the new government closed the academy as part of its reforms, cutting deep into the military's pride. Carmen saw the effect on her husband, not an outward display of anger, but a tightening, an inward resolve that hardened the lines of his face. The years that followed were a balancing act. Franco was assigned to posts that kept him visible, but at a safe distance from political storms. Carmen, in turn, kept their private life shielded from gossip or controversy. She understood that their greatest strength lay in his reputation for order and her image as the dutiful, devout wife, the antithesis of the Republic's revolutionary spirit. But Spain was not slowing down. Each year, the divisions deepened. Elections brought in governments that swung wildly between left and right, each undoing the work of the other. Violence became common in the streets. In Asturias, Carmen's home region, the miners' strike of 1934 erupted into open revolt, met with brutal suppression by government forces. Franco, appointed to oversee military operations, executed the campaign with precision and severity. To his supporters, he was the man who had saved Spain from chaos. To his enemies, he was a butcher. Carmen, hearing the whispers, focused instead on the necessity of the action. In her eyes, Asturias had not been crushed. It had been brought back into order. The Asturias Rising changed the way Spain saw Franco. It marked him as a man willing to act decisively against internal threats. It also brought him closer to the political stage, whether he sought it or not. Carmen knew what that meant. From now on, their lives would be watched not only by the military, but by the shifting alliances of political Spain. Every appearance, every word, every gesture mattered. By 1935, Franco was chief of the general staff, the highest position in the army. For Carmen, it was both a triumph and a warning. She could feel history closing in, the way the air grows still before a storm. Spain was moving toward a breaking point. She had learned enough from Franco's career to know that when the break came, it would not be repaired by speeches or debates. It would be repaired or destroyed by force. And as the elections of 1936 brought a leftist, popular front government to power, the streets of Madrid once again filled with chanting, the scent of smoke rising over the city. Carmen stood at the balcony of their home, looking out at the crowds. Somewhere in the noise, she thought she heard the echo of that summer night in her memory. Gunfire in the distance, the weight of pearls against her skin. The shadows of the Republic had grown long, and she knew they were stepping into a darkness from which there would be no turning back. The summer of 1936 pressed down on Madrid like a fever. The heat was heavy, the air thick with a tension that could not be spoken aloud without risk. In the markets, people kept their voices low. In the cafes, men leaned in over tables, words carried in whispers. It was a country living in the breathless moment before a strike. Carmen felt it in her bones. She had lived long enough in the shadow of politics to know that this was no ordinary unrest. The Popular Front government had emboldened the left. Street clashes between rival factions were no longer exceptions, but a daily reality. The killing of right-wing leader Jose Calvo Sotelo in July had pushed the fragile balance past breaking. For Carmen, it was not a question of if the military would act, but when. Franco, now stationed in the Canary Islands, a posting chosen by the government to keep him far from the political center, moved through these days with an unsettling calm. Publicly, he said little. Privately, he weighed every option. To join the coup being planned by senior officers would be to gamble everything: his career, his life, the safety of his family. To refuse would be to watch Spain descend further into chaos, perhaps beyond repair. It was in this space of hesitation that Carmen's influence became most acute. She did not argue for ambition's sake. She framed the decision in the language they both understood: duty, faith, and the survival of the Spain they believed in. To her, the coup was not merely a military uprising, it was a moral obligation. Every church burned, every priest killed, every tradition stripped away by the Republic had convinced her that this was the moment to stand against the tide. The conversations between them were not long or emotional. Carmen did not plead. She simply reminded him of what was at stake, of the Spain they had vowed to serve in their own way since the day they married. She spoke of Asturias, of the miners' revolt, of the order he had restored there. She asked what would become of the nation if no one acted now. And though Franco's expression betrayed nothing, she knew he was listening. By mid-July, the decision was made. The message came in the form of coded telegrams and whispered assurances. The uprising would begin within days. Franco, still in the Canary Islands, needed a way to the mainland. The plan would take him first to Morocco, where the Army of Africa, Spain's most seasoned and battle-hardened troops, awaited his command. On the morning he left, Carmen moved through their quarters with a deliberate calm. She folded his uniforms with precision, slipped the rosary into his pack, and set his pistol on the table beside him. She wore her pearls, as always, not out of vanity, but as a silent promise that she would hold her composure, whatever the days ahead would bring. The journey from the Canaries to Morocco was fraught with risk. Franco traveled in a small aircraft, skimming over the Atlantic toward the African coast, knowing that at any moment he could be intercepted. Carmen, left behind in Spain, entered her own kind of battle, the waiting war. Each day without word from him was a test of endurance. She kept her movements measured, her voice steady, her public demeanor untouched by the chaos beginning to grip the cities. When news came that Franco had successfully taken command in Morocco, Carmen understood the full weight of what they had stepped into. The coup, far from a swift seizure of power, had fractured the country. Large swaths of Spain remained loyal to the Republic. Other regions fell to the nationalists. It was no longer a question of political change. It was war. The Spanish Civil War erupted in fire and blood. Franco moved quickly, using the Army of Africa to secure territory in the south and then advancing northward. Carmen, now the wife of a man at the center of the conflict, became both a symbol and a target. To nationalist supporters, she was the embodiment of tradition and moral strength. To Republican sympathizers, she was the face of the reactionary elite that sought to crush their revolution. In private, she understood that her role had shifted. She was no longer just the steward of a household. She was the keeper of an image. Every appearance at a church service, every public act of charity, every carefully chosen word was part of the architecture of legitimacy being built around Franco's leadership. She knew that in war, power was not only won on battlefields but also in the hearts of those watching from a distance. Yet the war was young and the outcome uncertain. In those first months, as Spain's cities burned and its countryside fractured, Carmen carried within her the same quiet certainty she had felt on the night she had first heard the distant crack of gunfire in Madrid, that whatever history would call her husband, savior, dictator, tyrant, she would remain beside him, not only as a wife, but as a co-architect of the Spain they meant to forge from the ruins. And in the heat of that summer, as the coup bled into full-scale civil war, she also knew something else. From this point forward, there was no safe harbor left. Every step they took would be deeper into a conflict that would either secure their place in history or erase them entirely. The Civil War devoured Spain with a hunger that seemed to grow by the day. Towns changed hands overnight, flags rose and fell over the same rooftops within a week, and the air in every village seemed to carry both the smell of smoke and the weight of suspicion. By the winter of 1936, the nationalist uprising had hardened into a full, grinding war, and Francisco Franco, once just one among many generals, was now the figure whose shadow stretched across the movement. Carmen watched it happen from within the insulated yet fragile world of the nationalist rear lines. In the first months, the leadership had been a council of ambitious military men, each with their own vision for Spain, each wary of surrendering control to another. But Franco's march from the south, his decisive airlift of the Army of Africa into mainland Spain, and his unshakable discipline began to shift the balance. The other generals recognized in him something they lacked, a patience that could outlast any siege and an ability to appear inevitable. When he was named Generalissimo and head of state in September 1936, Carmen understood that this was more than a military promotion. It was a coronation in all but name. Franco was now not just leading troops. He was the face of the nationalist cause, the man who would define its war and, if victorious, its peace. And with that mantle came a crown of thorns. The nationalist territory was not free from its own fractures. Monarchists, Phalangists, Carlists, and hardline conservatives all jostled for influence within the movement. Franco's skill was to keep them in uneasy alignment, playing each faction against the others while projecting unity to the outside world. Carmen, for her part, became an unspoken asset in this balancing act. She was the embodiment of Catholic respectability, a figure whose presence reassured the old aristocracy, even as Franco absorbed the energies of the more radical Phalangists. Her life during the war was a study in contrasts. On one hand, she attended Mass under the vaulted ceilings of churches that still stood untouched in nationalist zones, her pearls catching the candlelight as she moved among officers' wives and clergy. On the other, she visited hospitals where the wounded lay in rows, their uniforms darkened with blood and dust. She brought blankets, food, and the small tokens of comfort that could be spared, knowing that each gesture carried not just compassion, but political weight. To the soldiers, she was a reminder of what they fought for: order, tradition, the image of a Spain unbroken. But war's reality did not spare her. Reports of mass executions, of prisoners taken and shot without trial, reached her as they reached everyone. These were not whispered rumors. They were part of the brutal machinery of the conflict. Carmen's faith in the cause remained, yet in quiet moments she could not entirely turn her mind from the human cost. She told herself, as Franco often did, that such measures were necessary to secure victory, that chaos could not be defeated without severity. But necessity did not make the knowledge easier to bear. By early 1937, Franco had begun reshaping the nationalist command into a unified structure, merging the various right-wing factions under his leadership. It was a political coup within the war itself, eliminating rivals while claiming to serve the greater unity of Spain. Carmen knew that the personal risk in such consolidation was enormous. A misstep could have turned allies into assassins. Yet Franco moved with the same caution and certainty that had always defined him. And as his position solidified, so too did hers. She became, in effect, the First Lady of nationalist Spain. Newspapers in their territory published carefully composed photographs of her at church services, charity events, or standing beside Franco during public addresses. Her wardrobe, her expressions, even the way she inclined her head toward her husband in photographs, all of it was curated to project stability and grace. She was not a speaker or a politician. She was something more enduring in the eyes of their supporters, the moral pillar behind the general. Yet the war dragged on, and with it came the slow grind of suffering. Cities like Madrid and Barcelona, still under Republican control, endured relentless bombing. Refugees streamed into nationalist areas, carrying stories of hunger and reprisals. Carmen listened to these accounts with a composed face, but she also recognized their value as propaganda. In private, she encouraged the careful telling of such stories to reinforce the righteousness of their cause. By 1938, the tide had turned decisively in the nationalists' favor. Franco's forces advanced on all fronts, cutting Republican territory into isolated pockets. For Carmen, this period was one of uneasy anticipation. Victory seemed inevitable, but she knew that the final stages of any conflict could be the most dangerous, politically as well as militarily. The alliances that held under the pressure of war could splinter in the spoils of peace. She kept her focus on preserving Franco's image as the indispensable leader, the man who had not only won the war, but deserved to shape the peace. In the spring of 1939, as the Republican defenses collapsed and Madrid prepared to surrender, Carmen thought back to the summer of 1936. The heat, the uncertainty, the whispered conversations, all of it had led to this. She had stood beside Franco at every step, not on the battlefield, but in the spaces where power was negotiated, legitimized, and preserved. Now the war's end was within reach, and with it came the beginning of a new chapter, one that would test not just Franco's rule, but the very foundations of the Spain they had fought to create. She understood the paradox of what was coming. Victory would crown them, but it would also bind them to the consequences of everything done in its pursuit. The war had given Franco absolute power. Peace would demand that he keep it. And for Carmen, the role she had played in the shadows would only grow more vital, for a crown won in war is never worn without the weight of its thorns. Madrid was silent when the nationalists entered. Not the silence of peace, but the breathless stillness that comes after the breaking of something once whole. On March 28, 1939, the city surrendered, and with it the Spanish Civil War came to an end. 3 years of blood and rubble had burned the fever of revolution from the capital's streets. But the cost was everywhere, in the hollow faces of the survivors, in the jagged gaps where buildings had stood, in the way people glanced over their shoulders even when there was no one following. For Francisco Franco, the victory was absolute. He stood alone as caudillo, head of state, generalissimo, leader of the new Spain. There was no parliament to answer to, no rival faction strong enough to challenge his authority. The coup he had joined in uncertainty had ended with him wearing the mantle of undisputed power. Yet Carmen knew that this was not the kind of triumph one parades through the streets. It was the kind a man wears inwardly, with the awareness that it had been purchased in suffering and secured by fear. They moved into El Pardo Palace, a sprawling residence on the outskirts of Madrid. Once a royal hunting lodge, it had been transformed into the symbolic heart of Franco's regime. For Carmen, stepping into its echoing halls was both an arrival and an assignment. The palace would not just be their home, it would be the stage on which the new image of Spain would be projected to the world. Every reception, every mass, every carefully staged photograph would serve as a reminder that order had returned, and that it wore Franco's face. Carmen adapted quickly to the role. She had always been meticulous in her public appearances, but now the scale was larger, the stakes higher. As First Lady, she became a living emblem of the regime's values: piety, dignity, tradition. Her pearls, once a personal talisman, became part of the uniform. When she appeared beside Franco in photographs, her expression was composed, her posture impeccable. In a country still reeling from war, she was meant to be a point of calm, the embodiment of the Spain that Franco promised to preserve. But outside the palace gates, reality was far from serene. The war had left hundreds of thousands dead, and the reprisals in its aftermath would claim thousands more. Political prisoners filled the jails. Executions were carried out without public record. Hunger stalked the cities, and in the countryside, villages struggled to rebuild with whatever scraps remained. Internationally, Spain found itself isolated. The world that had watched the Civil War with fascination now turned its gaze elsewhere, leaving Franco to rule a pariah state with little more than the resources within its own borders. In these early years, Carmen's influence was most visible in the cultural and religious sphere. She supported Catholic charities, encouraged the restoration of churches, and worked closely with organizations that aligned with the regime's moral vision. She understood that in a country exhausted by politics and violence, the language of faith could provide a sense of continuity and a way to knit loyalty to Franco into the fabric of daily life. Privately, she also understood the fragility of their position. Victory had secured Franco's rule, but peace had not yet secured the people's trust. Many supported him out of relief or fear rather than conviction. Others, especially those who had fought for the Republic, harbored a bitterness that would not fade with the signing of decrees. Carmen's role, as she saw it, was to help create an image of stability so convincing that even dissenters would find it difficult to imagine an alternative. The years between 1939 and 1945 were years of survival. Spain remained neutral in World War II, though Franco's sympathies leaned toward the Axis. Carmen shared his view that Spain, still recovering from its own war, could not afford to be dragged into another. Yet neutrality did not mean peace of mind. There were shortages, rationing, and a constant awareness that the outcome of the global conflict could alter Spain's fate overnight. Inside El Pardo, Carmen created a world that insulated Franco from unnecessary distraction. The palace ran with military precision, schedules were kept, visitors vetted, information filtered. She managed social affairs with an instinctive understanding of their political weight, ensuring that every banquet, every audience with foreign dignitaries reinforced the image of Franco not as a temporary ruler, but as Spain's permanent guardian. Still, she was not untouched by the war's ghosts. Letters came from old acquaintances whose families had been broken by the conflict. Priests spoke quietly of parishioners who had disappeared. Even in her charitable work, she sometimes encountered women whose husbands or sons had been taken and never returned. She never allowed such encounters to shake her public composure, but they lingered in her thoughts, reminders that the Spain she and Franco had built was not without its shadows. By the end of the war's first decade, the ruins were beginning to take shape into something resembling a nation again. Roads were repaired, fields replanted, cities slowly repopulated. Franco's grip on power was unchallenged, and Carmen's position beside him had become an unspoken fixture of the regime. Yet she knew the work was not finished. Spain's isolation would have to be broken, its economy rebuilt, its image rehabilitated in the eyes of a world that still saw it as a battlefield, frozen in time. And so she prepared herself for the next stage, one where the weapons would not be rifles and artillery, but diplomacy, trade, and the slow, deliberate shaping of perception. Franco had won the war. Now they would have to win the peace. And in this new campaign, Carmen's role would be as vital as it had been in the dark days when victory was still uncertain. The quiet, unyielding presence at his side, steadying the hand that held Spain's future. The guns of Spain had fallen silent, but the world beyond its borders was bracing for a storm greater than any the Iberian Peninsula had endured. In September 1939, just 5 months after Madrid fell to the nationalists, German forces swept into Poland, and the Second World War began. For Franco, it was a test of calculation. For Carmen, it was a test of composure. The Axis powers, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, had aided the nationalists during the Civil War. Their aircraft had flown in Franco's troops from Africa, their weapons had turned the tide in key battles, their advisors had stood beside his generals. Now, with Europe in flames, both expected Spain to repay the favor. To many within Franco's inner circle, joining the Axis seemed inevitable. Carmen understood the temptation, the ideological affinity, the sense of shared struggle against communism, the lure of regaining Spain's old imperial glory. But she also saw the other side. Spain was exhausted. Its economy lay in tatters, its people weary from 3 years of bloodshed. Entering another war would not bring glory. It would bring collapse. In the evenings at El Pardo, as Franco weighed the demands from Berlin and Rome against the reality on the ground, Carmen quietly reinforced what he already knew in his most guarded thoughts. The only way to preserve his regime was to stay out of the fight. Thus, Franco declared Spain non-belligerent, a diplomatic balancing act that leaned toward the Axis but stopped short of full alliance. It was a stance that required constant vigilance. German envoys pressed for bases, supplies, and troops. British diplomats sought assurances of Spanish neutrality. In public, Franco maintained an image of solidarity with the Axis cause, attending meetings with Hitler and Mussolini, posing for photographs that would reassure his wartime benefactors. In private, he made just enough concessions to the Allies to keep Spain from becoming a target. Carmen's role in this delicate dance was not in the negotiation rooms, but in the court of perception. She oversaw social functions at El Pardo, that welcomed diplomats from both sides, her manner unfailingly warm, yet revealing nothing of the regime's intentions. In a time when Spain could not afford to alienate either camp, her ability to extend the appearance of hospitality was as much a strategic asset as any military garrison. Yet the war's pressures were felt everywhere. Spain faced shortages of fuel, food, and basic goods. Rationing became a way of life. Bread lines wound through city streets. Carmen took care to be seen visiting soup kitchens, distributing supplies to the poor, and attending church services in working-class districts. These acts, carefully photographed and reported in the state press, reinforced the image of a regime that shared in the hardships of its people, even as life within the walls of El Pardo remained insulated from the daily grind of deprivation. Franco's cautious maneuvering paid off. By 1943, as the Axis began to falter, Spain's position as a neutral power became more valuable to the Allies. British and American diplomats sought closer ties, offering the possibility of easing Spain's isolation after the war. Carmen recognized the importance of these overtures. The future of Franco's Spain would depend not just on survival, but on acceptance by the post-war order. She began to envision a new role for herself, not merely as a domestic symbol of stability, but as a quiet ambassador for the Spain they wished to present to the world. Still, neutrality was not without its tensions. There were moments when the balance nearly tipped. In October 1940, Franco met with Hitler in the French border town of Hendaye. The meeting was tense, the demands heavy, and the promises uncertain. Franco returned without committing Spain to the Axis cause. Carmen saw in his face the toll of the encounter, the knowledge that he had refused one of the most dangerous men in Europe, and that such defiance carried risks that might not be fully revealed for years. Through it all, she maintained her role as the keeper of the regime's moral veneer. Her faith remained a visible constant, her pearls an unchanging symbol amid the shifting tides of war. In a country where scarcity touched nearly every home, her appearance never betrayed hardship. It was not vanity, it was strategy. To Carmen, the First Lady of Spain could not be seen as diminished, because to appear diminished was to suggest that the regime itself was faltering. By the time the war in Europe ended in 1945, Spain had avoided the devastation that had leveled so much of the continent. But the cost of survival was continued isolation. The victors, the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, had little interest in embracing a dictatorship born from civil war and allied, however, cautiously, with the defeated Axis. Spain was excluded from the newly formed United Nations. Foreign aid was scarce. The scars of war remained unhealed. Carmen understood that the next challenge would not be military or diplomatic alone, but one of perception. The world needed to see Spain not as a relic of fascism, but as a stable, Catholic, and reliable partner in the emerging Cold War. And she knew that in this campaign, fought not in trenches but in drawing rooms and state visits, her role would be more critical than ever. The guns had fallen silent, but another kind of battle was beginning, the fight to reintroduce Spain to a world that had moved on without it. And as always, she would be at Franco's side, the quiet figure in pearls who seemed to stand untouched by time, even as the future pressed closer. The summer of 1945 brought victory parades to London, mushroom clouds to the Pacific, and a new geopolitical map drawn by the victors of the Second World War. In this new order, Spain stood apart, not among the conquered, not among the Allies, but in a gray zone of suspicion. Franco had survived the war intact, his regime untoppled, but Spain's political isolation was absolute. The United Nations refused membership. Foreign embassies kept their distance. For Carmen, it was a strange kind of victory. They had preserved their power, but their Spain was an island surrounded by currents that could sweep it away. In the cold marble halls of El Pardo Palace, Carmen felt the pressure of the outside world in subtle ways. Fewer foreign dignitaries visited. When they did, their smiles were polite, but their conversations brief. Trade was restricted. Fuel and goods remained scarce. Even the glamour of official receptions seemed muted. The wine poured thinner, the flowers in the vases lasting just a little too long. Yet the world was shifting again. The wartime alliance between the West and the Soviet Union fractured almost immediately into suspicion and ideological rivalry. The Cold War had begun, and with it came a new logic. In the eyes of Washington, a staunchly anti-communist Spain might be more useful as an ally than as an outcast. This was the opening Franco had been waiting for, and Carmen sensed it too. Her role in this emerging chapter was not written in official policy papers, but it unfolded in the spaces where diplomacy was more art than contract. She hosted teas and luncheons for foreign wives, cultivated friendships with Catholic organizations abroad, and ensured that every photograph taken of her, whether in the palace gardens or kneeling at a cathedral altar, reinforced the image of Spain as a land of faith, stability, and order. In an era when the American public still saw Catholicism as a cultural anchor against atheistic communism, Carmen was the visual embodiment of the regime's moral claim. The first real breakthrough came in 1953 with the signing of the Pact of Madrid. Spain and the United States entered into a strategic agreement. American military bases would be established on Spanish soil in exchange for economic and military aid. For Franco, it was recognition. For Carmen, it was a chance to recast the narrative of Spain in the eyes of the world. She understood that the pact was not merely an exchange of strategic favors, but the beginning of a slow rehabilitation of Spain's image. When American dignitaries visited, Carmen made sure their receptions were layered with symbols. The scent of incense from a chapel blessing before the meal. The national dishes served in hand-painted ceramics from traditional regions. The carefully chosen music of Spanish classical composers playing softly under the murmur of conversation. She wanted them to leave not just with agreements signed, but with a feeling that Spain, for all its authoritarian edges, was a place of history, culture, and enduring grace. Economically, the pact marked the start of what would later be called the Spanish Miracle. Aid from the United States and investment from European partners began to trickle in. New industries emerged. Roads were built, and tourism, once a luxury for a select few, began to transform the coastal towns into destinations for Northern Europeans seeking sun. Carmen watched the changes with a mix of approval and caution. The growth was necessary, but she feared that too much openness would dilute the traditions she held sacred. Her public presence evolved during these years, no longer just the silent figure beside Franco at parades and speeches. She became a symbol in her own right. Featured in magazines, mentioned in the society pages, her image carefully managed by the state press. For the regime, she was the perfect counterpoint to Franco's austere, reserved demeanor. Approachable without being casual, dignified without appearing cold. But not all saw her as benign. Critics, especially in exile, painted her as part of the gilded elite that lived far from the shortages still felt in working-class homes. The nickname La Collares, the necklaces, followed her, a jab at her fondness for pearls and jewelry, even in times of austerity. Carmen did not publicly acknowledge the name, but she understood its sting. To her, the adornments were not excess, but armor, a statement that the dignity of the regime could not be diminished by scarcity. By the late 1950s, the transformation was visible. Spain, though still under a dictatorship, was no longer a total pariah. American tourists walked the streets of Madrid. International conferences brought journalists and delegates to Spanish cities. Carmen could feel the subtle shift at the palace. The room seemed warmer when visitors came. The conversations easier, the future less like a wall and more like a path. Still, she knew that the Cold War's embrace was conditional. The same powers that now valued Spain's strategic location could just as easily withdraw their favor if the political winds changed. It was a reality that kept her vigilant. Every handshake, every hosted dinner, every public appearance was part of a larger campaign, not only to secure Spain's place in the world, but to ensure that when history remembered Franco's regime, it would also remember the grace that had walked beside it. For Carmen, the Cold War was not fought in missile silos or on espionage maps. It was fought in the careful arrangement of flowers on a state dining table, in the choice of hymn for a cathedral mass attended by foreign guests, in the way she carried herself through rooms full of watchful eyes. And though the world called her husband Cadillo, She understood that in the quiet realm where perception became power, she too held a title, one that no official decree could give or take away. By the early 1960s, the Spain that Carmen looked out upon from the windows of El Pardo was not the same Spain she had first entered as the wife of a victorious general. The nation was richer, the streets busier, the hum of industry now mixing with the chatter of foreign tourists crowding cafes and beaches. To the outside world, Franco's Spain was stable, even modernizing. But within the palace walls, Carmen could sense the subtle shift in time's weight, and she could see it most clearly in her husband's face. Franco was no longer the unflinching young general who had marched across a war-torn country. His movements were slower, his hair thinner, his eyes shadowed with the fatigue of decades in command. The regime he had built was solid, but Carmen understood something that few dared to say aloud. Even the most unshakable leaders are mortal, and the question of what would follow him was no longer a distant one. Succession was a delicate subject. Franco himself resisted the idea of discussing it in concrete terms, preferring to believe that time still bent to his will. But Carmen knew that power left a vacuum when it passed, and a vacuum invited chaos. Within the ruling circles, factions were quietly positioning themselves for influence in a post-Franco Spain. Monarchists pushed for the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty. Phalangists argued for a continuation of the one-party state. The military, ever disciplined, waited to see which way the wind would turn. For Carmen, the stakes were deeply personal. Franco's legacy was not just his own, it was hers as well. She had walked beside him through war, isolation, and renewal, and the story told after his death would either enshrine her as the guardian of a national rebirth or reduce her to a footnote in a fading regime. She was determined to shape that story before others could write it. Her strategy was quiet but deliberate. She deepened her involvement in Catholic charities, strengthening her public image as a woman of faith and service. She encouraged the preservation of Francoist monuments and ceremonies, ensuring that his presence, and by extension hers, would remain woven into Spain's cultural fabric. She nurtured alliances with figures in the church, knowing that its voice would carry weight in any future settlement. At home, she focused on their only child, Maria del Carmen Franco y Polo, grooming her for the public role she might one day inherit as the custodian of the Franco legacy. Though the younger Carmen would never wield political power, her position in Spain's high society meant that she could serve as a bridge between the regime's history and its potential successors. In 1969, Franco made his most consequential decision regarding succession. He named Prince Juan Carlos de Bourbon as his heir, bypassing the exiled King Juan III. The choice was meant to secure a controlled transition to a monarchy that would preserve the regime's core values. Carmen approved, not because she fully trusted the young prince, but because the arrangement kept the decision in Franco's hands rather than leaving it to the chaos of political maneuvering after his death. But with that decision came a new challenge, ensuring that Franco's authority remained unquestioned during the years that remained. The 1970s brought economic difficulties and rising social unrest, fueled by a younger generation with no memory of the Civil War and little patience for the restrictions of authoritarian rule. Protests, strikes, and clandestine opposition movements began to spread. The world was changing, and Spain, despite its guarded borders, could not shut out the new currents. Carmen met this moment with the same composure that had carried her through darker times. She continued to appear beside Franco at public events, her pearls gleaming, her demeanor unchanged, as if time itself could be stilled by the certainty of her presence. She understood that the appearance of stability was as important as stability itself. So long as the people saw their leaders as unshaken, the foundations might hold. Still, in the quiet of El Pardo, she could feel the narrowing horizon. Franco's health, though guarded as a state secret, was becoming harder to conceal. His speeches were shorter, his steps more deliberate. She began to think less about the daily rhythms of governance and more about the shape of memory, how history would recall them when the last page of their chapter was written. To Carmen, the weight of the crown was not measured only in the years it had been worn, but in the responsibility to see it pass without shattering the structure it adorned. It was the burden of ensuring that when Franco's hand no longer held Spain's fate, The image of the nation and of the life they had built would remain intact. She knew that moment was coming. She also knew that when it did, the story of Franco would end. But the shadow of his rule and of her place within it would linger far longer than either of them would live to see. The first signs were subtle, almost easy to dismiss. Franco, long known for his endurance, began to pause more often during ceremonies. His voice, once steady and deliberate, grew softer, forcing listeners to lean in to catch his words. In the early 1970s, the man who had held Spain in his grasp for more than 3 decades was entering the slow but irreversible descent of age. Carmen noticed it before most. She knew his gait, the way he carried himself, the particular rhythm of his days, and she could feel the change in the way one feels a drop in the wind before a storm. To the outside world, Franco still appeared in command. He reviewed parades from the balcony, presided over state functions, and signed decrees in his own hand. But behind the guarded doors of El Pardo Palace, his energy was no longer inexhaustible. The long hours of meetings fatigued him. His once firm handwriting sometimes wavered. Carmen, who had spent her life at his side, understood that the regime could not afford the image of a leader diminished. She became the gatekeeper in a way she had never been before. Access to Franco was carefully managed. Requests for audiences were screened, schedules shortened, interruptions minimized. Only those whose presence was necessary and whose loyalty was beyond doubt were allowed close. It was not just about protecting his health. It was about controlling the flow of information, shielding him from political noise that could unsettle his composure. The Spain outside the palace was restless. Economic growth, once the pride of the regime, began to slow. Inflation rose, unemployment crept upward, and workers demanded higher wages. Students marched in defiance of restrictions on speech and assembly. In the Basque Country, ETA, the separatist militant group, escalated its campaign of violence. Each incident chipped away at the aura of total control that had defined Franco's rule. For Carmen, the challenge was to hold the facade together. She maintained the same impeccable appearances, attending Mass in full view of the press, visiting charitable institutions, and presiding over receptions with undiminished elegance. If Franco's physical strength was waning, then she would ensure that the image of the regime's stability remained unbroken in the public eye. In 1973, the assassination of Admiral Luis Carrero Blanco, Franco's chosen prime minister and loyal confidant, by ETA struck at the very heart of the regime. It was more than a loss of a trusted advisor. It was a warning that the order Franco had maintained could be challenged with deadly precision. Carmen felt the blow deeply. Carrero Blanco had been a figure who could have carried Franco's legacy forward in the form they envisioned. His absence left a gap no appointment could fully fill. Franco's health continued to decline, though the severity was concealed from the public. By 1974, he was experiencing symptoms of Parkinson's disease, his movements slower and more deliberate, his facial expression at times fixed in an almost mask-like stillness. Carmen ensured that photographers caught him at his best angles, that speeches were timed for moments of peak energy, that his presence in public was never so long as to reveal fatigue. Privately, she began to prepare for the inevitable. She oversaw the preservation of personal archives, worked discreetly with loyalists to ensure that memorials and monuments would stand after Franco was gone, and made certain that their daughter Maria del Carmen was positioned within the elite circles that would remain influential in the new Spain. She could not control the political system that would follow, but she could control the legacy, the narrative that would frame Franco's decades in power as a period of stability, faith, and national pride. The final public image that the regime would project became her focus. She knew that when the end came, it could not appear chaotic or uncertain. Franco's farewell to Spain must be staged with the same discipline that had marked his rule. That meant careful orchestration of his appearances, the management of press coverage, and even the choreography of how the nation would be told of his passing. By 1975, the Caudillo's strength was visibly faltering, yet there was no public admission of illness. In October, as he appeared for what would be one of his last balcony addresses, Carmen stood just behind him, her face unreadable, her pearls catching the pale autumn light. The crowd roared as he raised his hand in salute, but she could feel the tremor in his fingers. The man before them was still the leader they knew, but the weight of time was pressing hard against him. In those moments, Carmen understood that her life's work, the role she had played through decades of war, isolation, diplomacy, and renewal, was entering its final act. Soon the crown that had been theirs together would pass from his head, and with it would go the Spain they had built. The task now was to ensure that when history closed its chapter on Francisco Franco, it would also remember the image they had crafted. Unshaken, orderly, and, in the eyes of their supporters, eternal. The autumn of 1975 settled over Madrid with an air of suspended breath. The leaves turned to rust and gold, the city's avenues bathed in soft light. But inside El Pardo Palace, there was no warmth in the season. Francisco Franco lay in a hospital bed installed within the palace walls, his body failing in slow increments. What began as fatigue and labored speech had escalated into a cascade of illnesses: heart trouble, blood loss from surgery, and an infection that drained what little strength remained. Each week, the circle around him grew smaller, more protective, more silent. Carmen sat at his bedside through the long nights, the steady beep of medical monitors replacing the rhythms of conversation that had once filled those hours. She had lived beside this man for more than half a century, through campaigns in Morocco, the ashes of civil war, the years of isolation, and the triumph of renewed alliances. Now she watched his hands, hands that had signed orders, saluted troops, and steered the fate of Spain, lie still against the white sheets. Outside the palace, the government worked quietly to choreograph the end. Franco's illness was reported to the public only in vague terms: a temporary setback, an operation to address a minor issue. The truth was more stark. The caudillo was dying, and the regime was managing his decline as it had managed his life, with control, with discipline, with the understanding that image was as important as reality. Carmen was at the center of this management. She approved visitors, oversaw which photographs would be released, and made certain that the dignity of the man she had walked beside would not be undermined by the indignities of illness. The air in Madrid grew heavier with rumor. Crowds gathered outside churches, lighting candles and praying for his recovery. Others, in quieter corners, began to imagine a future without him. The international press waited for news, their headlines already drafted. The opposition in exile whispered of change. But within El Pardo, Carmen's focus was not on speculation. It was on preserving the ceremony of his final days. On November 20th, 1975, at just after dawn, Francisco Franco died. The moment was at once intimate and vast, personal and national. Carmen stood in the room as the doctors confirmed what she already knew. She did not weep openly, her grief was contained. As it had been through every crisis they had endured, the man who had been her husband, her partner in ambition, the axis around which her life had turned, was gone. The state moved quickly. His body was prepared in uniform, his medals arranged with precision. The funeral would be a display of grandeur, a final act of theater designed to bind his image to the idea of Spain he had spent decades shaping. Carmen oversaw the details that mattered to her: the placement of the rosary in his folded hands, the choice of hymns, the subtle use of religious symbols that would anchor the ceremony in Catholic tradition. For 3 days, Franco lay in state at the Palacio de Oriente, his coffin draped with the red and gold of Spain. Thousands filed past, some in solemn mourning, others in curious silence, still others in quiet satisfaction that an era had ended. Carmen remained a fixed presence, dressed in deep black, her face a mask of composure. Her pearls were absent now, replaced by a simple black veil, a visual concession to grief, but also a statement that she understood the solemnity of the moment. On the day of the funeral, the procession wound through Madrid to the Valley of the Fallen, the vast basilica Franco had commissioned as a monument to those who had died in the Civil War. Foreign dignitaries walked alongside Spanish officials. The tolling of church bells echoed through the stone corridors. As the coffin was lowered into the crypt, Carmen stood at the edge of the grave, the flickering light of candles casting long shadows against the walls. In that vast and echoing space, the weight of their shared life pressed down on her. The victories, the compromises, the burdens borne in silence. When the final prayers were said and the crowd began to disperse, Carmen lingered a moment longer. For the public, this was the end of Francisco Franco. For her, it was the severing of a partnership that had defined every step of her adult life. She knew the world outside was already shifting, that the Spain they had built would not survive in its pure form for long. But she also knew that, for as long as she lived, she would guard the memory of the man she had stood beside, through triumph and ruin, until the last light faded from his eyes. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Madrid seemed suspended between two eras. In one, Franco still stood at the balcony, his hand raised in salute. In the other, the balcony was empty, the voice that had defined a nation now silent. Carmen returned to El Pardo that night alone, the rooms echoing with absence. And though the crown had passed, she understood that the shadow of its weight would remain with her until her own last day. In the days after Franco's funeral, the quiet inside El Pardo Palace was unlike anything Carmen had ever known. For decades, the air had carried the steady rhythm of military order. Footsteps in the corridors, the muted clatter of typewriters, the murmur of aides carrying news. Now it was still. The man who had been the center of every conversation, the gravity around which the whole palace turned, was gone. The silence was both a relief and a wound. Outside those walls, Spain began to move quickly. King Juan Carlos I, Franco's chosen successor, swore allegiance to the constitution of a monarchy reborn, and within months the process of dismantling the dictatorship began. Political prisoners were released, censorship eased, opposition parties legalized. The transition was cautious but unmistakable. The country was stepping away from the rigid order that had defined the Franco years. For Carmen, each change was a reminder that the Spain she had helped to shape was already slipping into the past. She did not oppose it publicly. She rarely spoke in public at all. But in private, she carried the weight of a personal mission to guard the memory of her husband against the erosion of time and politics. She understood that history could be rewritten, that the man remembered as a savior by some could just as easily be painted as a tyrant by others. She retreated from political life, choosing instead to appear only at events that honored Franco's legacy. Annual masses were held in his memory. She attended them in black, her face set in the same composed expression she had worn through the hardest years of their life together. Loyalists still bowed when she entered a room. For them, she was not merely the widow of the caudillo. She was the last living embodiment of an era they believed had saved Spain from chaos. Her own public image remained carefully managed. She lived in seclusion but not in obscurity. Photographs of her, taken as she arrived at memorial services or greeted visiting dignitaries, still found their way into the newspapers. The pearls returned, not as a mark of vanity, but as a deliberate symbol that she had not been diminished by widowhood. To the world she presented the same unshaken dignity, as if time itself could not touch her composure. But in the privacy of her home, the absences multiplied. The chair at the head of the table remained empty. The sound of Franco's measured footsteps, gone. The evenings, once filled with the business of state, were now quiet enough for her to hear the ticking of the clock on the mantel. She kept his office exactly as it had been, the papers neatly stacked, the pens aligned, the rosary on the desk. It was less a workspace now than a shrine. Years passed. Spain changed. A younger generation grew up with no memory of the Civil War, no memory of the years when Franco's portrait hung in every public building. To them, Carmen was a figure from photographs in history books, her name tied to a regime they learned about in classrooms rather than in the streets. Still, for those who remembered, veterans, clergy, officials who had served under her husband, she remained a symbol of loyalty and endurance. Carmen Polo y Martínez-Valdés died in 1988, at the age of 88. Her funeral was smaller than her husband's, but it drew those who still felt bound to the legacy they had built together. She was laid to rest not far from the man she had walked beside for over 50 years, their lives intertwined in history as tightly as they had been in marriage. In the years since, debates over Franco's place in Spain's story have only deepened. Streets bearing his name have been renamed, monuments moved or removed, and the Valley of the Fallen itself has become a contested symbol. Yet in the photographs from her later years, Carmen's image remains unchanged. The black dress, the pearls, the composed gaze, and so her life closes as it began in the public eye. A study in controlled elegance, her true thoughts known only to herself. The final image is not of Franco's balcony or the Valley of the Fallen, but of a quiet room in El Pardo, years after both of them have gone. A single chair by the window, a thin beam of afternoon light falling across it. On the seat rests a rosary and a string of pearls, the dust motes drifting slowly in the still air. Outside, Spain moves on. Inside, the shadow of a life's work lingers, neither wholly celebrated nor entirely condemned, simply there, waiting for history to decide what it was worth. History remembers Franco as Spain's iron fist, but perhaps in the shadows it was Carmen's quiet hand that kept it clenched.